Join me in welcoming Mr. Joe Cardenas. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, man. I have a couple of stories about Rich. I can tell you afterwards. When he was a student. I do, seriously. No. Okay. So I must confess, we had a number of meetings, Alvaro, Colin, Rich and myself, about everyone was going to talk about something different. And, every time, I've listened to all three talks, and they kind of got into my territory a few times. So if I repeat myself, it's their fault, not mine. Anyway, okay. I think, is this good, recording-wise? Okay, very good. So we have heard, from Colin and from Alvaro and from Rich, different aspects of the technology that we have. And what's clear is that here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. So the question is, what do we do? How do we handle it? How do we benefit from it? And maybe every family has one of the themes, we just had that wonderful kind of conversation upstairs in the library. And it was clear from the different families that everyone has had a different path, a different journey. And there are different points in the journey. But regardless of where your family is, whether you have only a third grader and you're thinking what to do, or you have a 11th grader or a 10th grader that has a phone and you're like, oh my goodness, what do I do? Or maybe I shouldn't have given him a phone. Regardless of where you are, I think there's kind of two things that we can think about in terms of addiction. And a caveat, I am not an expert on addiction by any stretch of the imagination, but I've been mentoring young people for 30 years. And I am on the receiving end of a lot of conversations about phones and phone use over the years. And some are great stories, some of them are pretty sad. There's everything. And it is precisely that experience that I hope that is informing the things that I want to say. And I guess I have my glasses, so I'll have to go back and forth. There's also not a lot of light here. Anyway, this is all good. Good technology. So the first one is this issue of the addiction to this constant barrage of information and entertainment, noise. If you go anywhere, you're ordering food from someplace, and anybody who's waiting for food, they're on their phone. There's no one who's not in their phone. If you're at an airport, everyone is on their phone. It's what we do. It's just like, it seems like there's no other possible way of being anymore. And I think that desire for entertainment and noise often fills a gap, right? Something that is missing. Whether if it's, I want to be accepted, and I'm going to refer more to teenagers and middle school students. I think this is obviously very different for lower school students. But we all want to belong. We all want to be loved and accepted, recognized, patted in the back. I think this is a very human desire that we have and a need. We need to be loved and understood. That's part of what makes us human. So this addiction to entertainment and noise and likes and followers, it's understandable, and it's not shocking. But there could also be other reasons for this desire for noise and entertainment, which is the fear of facing ourselves. And I think it can happen, especially for teenagers as they're growing up. They're trying to figure out who they are, what group they belong to, how do they fit into society. They're always going to be, there's a center of fear of suddenly being quiet. What I did just now, that silence, we are afraid of it. As a society, it's awkward. And that's why, you go to the metro, you take the subway in New York, and everybody's got their AirPods. And that's great because no one has to talk to each other. And I think, maybe I'm exaggerating, but how do we handle that fear of facing reality or facing ourselves and our shortcomings and our ups and downs in life? And there's a great quote from Pascal who says, all of our humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. When I first read that, I was like, what? How does that fix any problems, But as I get older, I realize how important it is for us to think about our approach to life, right? And for teenagers to face themselves. And you will be surprised how many of our boys and students, not just here, because I'm mentoring many places during the summer as well, they need to go to bed listening to music. And they can't fall asleep unless they're listening to music. It's almost as if they're afraid of the silence. Or if they're working out, they need to have their AirPods. Anywhere they are, this idea of noise and the constant desire for entertainment. And I think what Pascal was getting at is that sometimes being quiet and facing our problems and for our students to think about, okay, am I a good son? Am I a good friend? Am I using my time well? Am I, all these questions that need to be asked and they often don't ask themselves. And the noise protects them. There is Cardinal Sarah, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He has a book about silence, the power of silence. And there he says the following: noise becomes a tranquilizer, a sedative, a morphine pump, a sort of incoherent dream world. But this noise is a dangerous, deceptive medicine, a diabolic lie that helps man avoid confronting himself in his interior emptiness. That's kind of intense. When I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm never going to listen to anything again. I've got to, be attentive and pay attention. But I think we need to think about how do we foster silence? And of course, if, I come from a family of 13, silence was unheard of, no pun intended. But it was tough. But I think, I can tell you, my dad, for example, during the summer, we went, this was a great summer vacation home we had in the southern part of Spain. And we went there for 2 months. It was like very old school vacation. But at the end of lunch, he would make us be quiet for an hour and a half. We had to read. It was totally quiet. It was a habit that he had developed, and my mom and my dad really pushed for that. And it was terrific. I read tons of books during the summer because we had that required kind of quiet time. And it was super helpful. But that's just one example. Even in a family of 13, it's possible to do. But one of the things that I was thinking is sort of possible ways. I have 4 suggestions of things we can try at home to develop this idea of silence and kind of thinking time or silence so that we can fill it in with conversation. One, and this has been said by every single person today, Alvaro, Colin, and Rich, but I can't emphasize this enough, we need to lead by example. It's super important. I have a brother who has 4 daughters, and the youngest one is like, I think, 8 or 9, and he never uses his phone in front of them. He's a doctor, so he's a guy who needs to have his phone. He gets called from the hospital, but he just made it a habit. It's like, I'm not going to use my phone unless I'm in the car using it for driving from one place to the other. Now, that may not be possible. It may not be possible to do so in your circumstances, but kind of thinking outside the box, like, what can I do so that my children can access me and talk to me? I'm going to give you a kind of, this is a good example, my brother. I love my brother, of course. But I'm going to give you a negative example of something I saw recently. I needed to grade a stack of art history exams, and I needed silence. So I couldn't be here, I couldn't be at home, so I went to Starbucks. And because kind of the background noise, it doesn't bother me. And I was sitting there, and there was a dad with 3 children, young children. And I was there probably for like an hour and a half grading, and he was on his phone all the time. Now, it may have been an emergency, in which case I understand, you got to be on your phone. But all his interaction with his kids was, hey, be quiet, eat that. Okay, I went back to the phone. Now, I shouldn't judge him because I have no idea the circumstances, but from the outside, I just felt, wow, this is the only interaction with his kids was just, hey, be quiet, eat that. I'm on my phone. So anyway, just to think about kind of how do we lead by example. The second thing we can think about is creating kind of quiet study time at home. And again, that may be super difficult, it may not be possible, but having like time frames where, okay, everybody put the phone somewhere and let's study. Maybe it's in the kitchen table, maybe it's in the study room. I remember a student coming up to me a few years back, like maybe 2 or 3 years back, he's in college now, and he told me, Mr. Cardenas, I'm getting C's, but I'm serious. I study 2 hours every day. Like I'm telling you, I'm not lying to you. Okay, all right, well, maybe we need to think about how you study. So we sat down and we went through kind of what's happening. And I said, well, do you have your phone with you? Well, yeah, I needed to keep track of time. Okay, all right, good. Do you use it for anything else? Well, maybe sometimes I get a text. Okay, how many do you get in those 2 hours? Well, maybe like 70 or so. Okay, all right, and do you reply to all of them? Well, of course I have to reply, And who is the person? Well, it's my girlfriend. Okay, so there's no way he was studying, right? So kind of creating environments where your son can study. So kind of think about what can I do to help them develop that sense of reflection and study, okay? And just kind of the quiet time. So besides by leading by example, taking their phones, and they're gonna have lots of reasons. I need my phone for a calculator. I've heard that one. Buy a calculator. You don't need a phone for that. I'm timing it. Well, use an hour clock. Just like figure out another way. But this is an interesting study that was done at a college where a number of, I think it was like about 100, 150 students were brought into a classroom and they were giving a lecture. And at the end of the lecture, they were split into 3 groups and they were giving a test on the lecture that they just heard. 1/3 had their phones with them, whatever they wanted. The other, third had it in their backpack. And the third one, their phones was in a different room. And the grade of that test correlated to how close their phone was to them. So the farther the phone was from them, the higher the grade. Now, obviously, this is just one study, but it's an interesting thing to think about, like even in our conversations, having the phone next to us and things like that. So creating in our homes a space for silence and for study, for contemplation. Number 3, another thing we can do is, regarding this sort of sense addiction to noise and kind of entertainment, is to create a space and time for conversation. And we have to be very deliberate about it because it's not easy, because we have things to do, we have games to go to drive to. I mean, it's like, especially now that we have so many things, we're so scheduled. So creating the possibility of conversation is very hard. So it might be, walking the dog, it might be going on hikes, conversation during dinner, and really working at it. I mean, this thing of dinner, I remember going to an airport, I think it was in Ottawa, maybe, I don't remember. And in the airport, all the tables for the restaurants had iPads in every place setting. I don't know if anybody has seen that. When you go in there, like, wow, how is anybody going to talk if you have an iPad sitting in front of you? I know, I was surprised that you see like a family and they're all looking at different things. So I think creating this space for conversations, and you're here because you're probably doing that already, but kind of being very intentional about it. In the car, playing board games instead of watching a movie can be difficult, and maybe there's, that's so boring. Anyway, there's going to be some pushback, obviously, but it's good to think about what's possible. And also preparing, like some of the families we're talking about, being the party house, kind of creating the space for people to come and be together. I think that the other thing that we can think about is just spending time, like maybe going for an ice cream, for coffee. I mean, there's so many. I think that once you start thinking about what's possible, you'll create opportunities for conversation with everyone in the family. But otherwise, the easy thing is to watch a movie, another Netflix series and things like that. But that's the easy way. But if we're intentional, then we create space for silence and for communication. I think another thing we could think about is other possibilities is creating times for daily routines for quiet. So it might be that in the car, instead of turning on the radio for the news, or listen to a podcast or listen to music, you just don't do anything. Maybe say a part of the rosary, maybe say a decade, maybe talk, maybe if everybody's quiet, well, let it be silence. I think that's okay. We need to kind of grow used to this idea of silence. Because ultimately, at the highest level, one of the most kind of, I would say, dangerous things about this noise, this entertainment culture that we have, where we need to be constantly we have to have the stimuli of whether if it's music or videos or chatter, is that it will affect our prayer life, our interior life. There's a couple more quotes that I have here. One is from Cardenas again. He says, "Without silence, God disappears into the noise." Which is interesting, right? If you're constantly listening to things, you're constantly bombarded, there's no interior life because it's always busy with things that are coming into your brain. And it's hard to say a small prayer or say an aspiration. Those things disappear if we're constantly bombarded. This is from St. Josemaria. He says, "Silence is the doorkeeper of the interior life." And I think we all have a sense of that. If our son is playing video games for 3 hours and then goes to Mass, it's going to be very difficult to concentrate during Mass. Or if he's, listening to hip hop, these again, high school guys more, and then suddenly, okay, well, let's do a little time of prayers. It's impossible. Like your brain is like going 100 miles per hour in every direction, right? Because you've been listening to music or playing video games. So I think this idea of the quiet time, the in-between times that we all go reach for our phones, it's good to push back and for ourselves. I remember one time I had given a little presentation to the 9th graders it was 10th graders, about the use of their phone and how people are always, whenever they have a free moment, they pull out their phone. And he said, "I'm going to practice that. I'm not going to do it. I want to try that." So he was waiting for his food in Five Guys. I kind of looked around, and he was like, "Wow, everybody's on their phones." And then he saw someone reading the Odyssey in a table, a book, and he was like, "Oh my gosh." So he went up to the guy, he's like, "You're reading the Odyssey?" I'm like, "Yeah. Would you like the Odyssey?" And they had a great conversation about the Odyssey, so it can happen. And I had another guy, started practicing, he was an 11th grader, practicing this idea of not using his phone while waiting for something. And he said, one thought led to the other, and I realized I hadn't gone to confession in a long time. So right there and then I decided, next time I'm going to go to confession. Again, he allowed for silence to happen, and beautiful things happen. In this case, confession or a great discussion about the Odyssey. Again, we need to create this space. I'll finish with this quote. "The disease of the modern age is that lack of reflection, that continuous and quite feverish pursuit of external things, which gradually causes the heart to lose sight of its nobler ideals, drowning them in a sea of impermanent earthly things and preventing them from contemplating higher eternal things." It's an awesome quote. What's the best thing about this quote? It was that it was written in 1929 by Pope Pius IX, right? And it could be right out, this is perfect for our time. And I think that's the thing, that we've had this before. We've been in this situation. I think we need just this idea of the addiction to noise and entertainment. We just need to push back in different ways. And again, each family is different, but beginning with ourselves and then with our children. Let me talk now about the second type of addiction, this sort of behavior towards kind of addiction to pornography. We know, and I don't think I need to tell anyone, that it's not a good thing. I think that's pretty obvious, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But the one thing that I would focus on is how to accompany and support our children when, in fact, something like this, you kind of find out, what do I do now, right? Because, let's face it, Alvaro mentioned this already, we have a fallen nature, and we're bombarded constantly by all these things, So the question is, how do we support our children? And again, if you have a lower school student, this is very different, but certainly something you can think about for the future. If you have a middle school student, that certainly could be a problem, and in high school could be a problem as well. And I will start with a story, because I think parents can play a huge role in how we react to when we find out the situation. I got a call from a father. This was maybe like 6, 7 years ago. And he said, Mr. Cardenas, I just don't know what to do. I said, what happened? What's going on? He goes, well, I was cleaning up my son's room because it was like like an atomic bomb had hit the room, and I needed to like clean it up, and I've been trying, and he just wouldn't do it, so I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do it. He was in school, so I went through everything, cleaned it up, and under the bed, I found a pornographic magazine, which of course he didn't have a phone, so this guy, I don't know how he got a hold of that. I didn't even know they existed anymore, but the other was, he had it, and he was like, I just don't know what to do. Like, I was in his room, I don't wanna, he's gonna get angry that I was there, he's gonna get like, and who am I to go through his stuff? And I was like, listen, what a great opportunity you have to help your son. This is providential. And it was amazing. Like we walked through kind of what things that he could say, and I knew the kid really well, and it was fantastic. The kid really benefited from that moment. But it struck me, one of the things that struck me the most about that conversation was he was afraid, the father was afraid of like, oh, but it's his privacy. Like, how am I to, like, I was going through his stuff, The way I think about this is, he's your son. He needs you. And he needs you to like be very upfront and to help him through these difficult circumstances. He's gonna feel horrible. And I tell you, because I spend many times talking with young people, that they feel really, when they go through this difficult, addiction, that they feel dirty, they feel gross, they don't want to do it, they want to fight the good fight, they go to confession regularly. And if you find out, right, it's because they really want your help. So I would say a few things to think about. First, don't be surprised. I think we have a fallen nature, and society it's okay with it quite often. I remember in a charter school in New York that I was volunteering. This was about 10 years ago. And I was talking to one of the dads, like, hey, this is a real problem. And he goes, well, they need to explore. I'm like, oh my goodness. It was super cool. I was like, I've never heard a dad say that about that, but it's out there, right? We live in a community that clearly doesn't like it. But it's good to know that it's a problem that we need to, that many people think is okay. Not okay, but kind of like, well, they're kids, So I would say don't be surprised if you hear that it happens. Second, we need to overcome a natural hesitancy to address it, right? Because it's awkward. And it's difficult to speak about these things with our sons, very difficult. And they may find it even more awkward to talk about it. So I think it's facilitating sincerity, whether if it's, maybe starting a conversation, say, I know this is difficult for many people, or maybe you are tracking his phone and you find out that he's doing stuff that you rather he wasn't doing. Have a conversation with him and be understanding. Like, okay, what can we do? How can I help you? How can I support this great struggle? Accompanying him in the struggle to be better. Always keep in mind that if your son brings it up at some point, it's difficult for them to do, by the way, but if they do, it's because they need help, and they want help. Otherwise, they will never bring it up with you. So have a sense, kind of like have a sense of how can I help them facilitate this conversation. And it might be that, again, one of the times you decide to bring it up with him. Maybe dad is easier, I think, for these conversations perhaps, but not to be afraid, not to be kind of like, oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I talk about this? I think two things that you can do also to help them live this virtue and address it when it comes is know that you track everything. I remember talking to a senior recently who told me, my mom told me that she would check every message that I saw, she would check everything. And I was so angry when she told me that. I was a freshman, and I was super angry. But now that I'm a senior, I am so grateful because I never got into that stuff. And I know some of my friends have, but I was lucky to have a mother who basically said, I want to check everything. So again, this is something that they will fight tooth and nail, but it's totally worth it. Also to know, and this is something Alvaro mentioned, that it's okay to take their phone away if you feel that they're not ready for it anymore, that you're going to have to pull back. And it may be a difficult thing, and they may be quite angry, but you just say, listen, I'm sorry, I apologize. And it's worth it. It's worth this. This might be something they need to face. So these are just, but this idea of accompaniment and praying for them when they face it, when you find out that this is a problem, is super important. And they need to have you need to be on their side. You need to be on their side all the way. Maybe before kind of thinking of wrapping it up and everything, I want to mention a quote that Rich brought up earlier, which is something that John Paul II said about pornography, that it's not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little, right? That it doesn't show the soul. And one way to think about pornography also is that we need grace. That this is not something we can battle often just by ourselves. And aside from all the filters and routers and barks and all those things that we've been talking about, there's also grace. And so, for example, it might be that facilitating going to confession on a regular basis. Now, I would say, right, because the soul needs that spiritual food that we get through the sacraments. And, without pushing our kids to go to confession because they'll react quite often the opposite direction. But maybe on Saturdays, hey, I'm going to go to confession. Anybody wants to come? I mean, each family, again, is different, how you work out those plans. But facilitating the possibility, especially in the summer, perhaps, when they're not at the heights where it's much more accessible. But confession can be a wonderful way to fight back this addiction. Obviously, communion and kind of receiving the sacraments, praying together as a family can be also a terrific thing. But grace is needed. And, I was just talking with someone last week who struggled with this, in high school. But now, as a college student, is having a blast and enjoying true love, right? And he said, I struggle. I had the support of my parents, but like him, there's probably many, many people who have overcome this. So I would say kind of that optimism that we should communicate to our children if we find out that they're kind of falling into this. That importance of, not being shocked when we hear it. Loving them with their defects. And this is one of them, right? And it feels dirty and gross, but listen, we, again, fallen nature, and we're trying our best to overcome it. And this is kind of the last point I'd like to make, and kind of two things. One, facilitating living virtues. So a lot of the things that Colin said earlier about trust and developing this sense of trust and virtues, kind of where they can grow and experience and have risks, but always kind of within the confine of the home and the support that you give your children. But that living that virtue requires some element of freedom, right? Otherwise, it's you making the decisions. And then modeling our behavior to the best of our ability, despite the busyness that we have and the things that we need to check. But doing these two things, that living virtue and modeling our behavior, can really have an effect on the way they kind of fight back these two addictions of addiction to noise and addiction to pornography. Thank you. That's it.